Lucas Mercer leaned back in his plush chair, swirling a glass of vintage wine in his hand, watching the lights of the sprawling space station outside the panoramic window. The hum of the gala around him barely registered. To the high society elites mingling and laughing in their extravagant gowns and sharp tuxedos, he was nothing more than another rich, charming heir to an intergalactic fortune. But to Lucas, that was exactly the point. The night was his, as it always was. His family's business empire spanned galaxies, and he'd inherited not just the wealth but the status, the effortless charm that made people gravitate toward him. Women, especially, flocked to him, seeking his approval, his attention, as though it was a privilege just to breathe the same air as him. He had them all figured out. It was just a game Lucas always won. Across the room, a group of his closest friends, wealthy, powerful men and women, gathered around a table, laughing at some joke only they understood. They were the type who shared more in arrogance than actual friendship. Yet, Lucas felt a strange pull toward them tonight, like something was missing. He leaned forward, curiosity creeping in. "Mercer!" shouted one of his friends, a hulking alien named Zarkin, his reptilian skin glistening under the station's artificial lights. "We've got a bet for you." Lucas's lips curled into a smile, his interest piqued. He could outwit anyone in the room, everyone knew that. But a bet? A challenge was just what he needed to stave off the creeping ennui of his life. "What's the wager?" Lucas asked, leaning toward them with an air of feigned disinterest. Zarkin's grin stretched wider. "We've heard the rumors, Lucas, that you're unbeatable when it comes to women. But what if we told you there's one woman who's not impressed by your wealth, your charm, or your, well, anything?" Lucas raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And you think I can't win her over?" The group chuckled. It was a mocking laughter, but one that Lucas didn't mind. It fed into his ego, the part of him that needed to prove something. Zarkin nodded toward the edge of the room, where a striking figure stood alone, sipping a drink from a silver chalice, her presence cutting through the crowd like a blade through silk. Lucas followed the direction of the gaze. She was tall, but not impossibly so. Her skin shimmered with a soft green hue, like polished jade, and her striking violet eyes glinted with quiet confidence. There was no hint of a smile on her face, and she held herself like she didn't care for the opulence surrounding her. Unlike the women who often tried to draw his attention, this one didn't fawn over him. Lucas's lips curved into a grin, the challenge clearly set in his mind. "The bet is simple," Zarkin continued. "You have to make her fall for you. If you succeed, we'll pay up. If not, you owe us a favor, a big one." Lucas leaned back in his chair, considering the challenge. A part of him was annoyed by the insinuation that there was a woman in the galaxy immune to his charms, but the larger part of him, his competitive, dominant side, felt a surge of excitement. This wouldn't be like the others. This one would be different. "I accept," Lucas said, a self-assured smile creeping onto his lips. "But you'll regret this." Zarkin's grin widened, and the group erupted into laughter again. They knew they were witnessing the start of something amusing, but they also knew Lucas. The man could get anything or anyone, no matter how impossible the challenge seemed. As Lucas stood up, adjusting his suit, he locked eyes with the woman across the room. She didn't acknowledge him, but Lucas wasn't concerned. He'd won over tougher crowds. He made his way toward her, his strides long and confident, knowing the eyes of the room were on him. She didn't move, didn't flinch as he approached. Lucas took a moment to observe her more closely. Her poise, her quiet strength. There was something about her that made her stand apart from the others. She wasn't here to impress anyone, and that intrigued him even more. He stopped just a few feet away from her, his usual charming grin spreading across his face. "May I?" Lucas asked, motioning toward the empty seat next to her. She didn't respond immediately, her gaze lingering on the drink in her hand, as if weighing the moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, without the softness he was used to hearing from women he approached. "You're Lucas Mercer, aren't you?" she asked, her eyes finally meeting his. There was no awe in them, just a cold clarity. "I am," he said smoothly. taking a seat beside her without waiting for her permission. "And you are?" "Zyria," she answered simply, taking another sip of her drink, her posture never shifting. "Zyria," Lucas repeated, savoring the name as it left his lips. "Beautiful name. It suits you." She didn't respond, but her eyes flickered with something. Amusement, maybe even disdain. Lucas wasn't used to that. He was used to the butterflies, the shy glances, the sudden warmth in a woman's eyes when he smiled. But Zyria was different. She was unmoved, unreadable. "I hear you're quite the challenge," he said, his tone laced with curiosity, a hint of arrogance. "So, tell me, what does it take to win your heart?" She set her drink down gently, her gaze never leaving his. "Nothing," she said simply. "I'm not interested in games." Lucas chuckled softly, his confidence never wavering. "You don't know me very well, do you?" She raised an eyebrow but remained silent. It was a silence that spoke volumes, and Lucas found himself intrigued. What kind of woman was this? He couldn't let her slip through his grasp. Not without a fight. "I think you'll find," Lucas said, his voice dropping to something a little more intimate, "that I don't lose." Zyria finally looked at him, her violet eyes sharp and calculating. "You won't win me with money or charm," she replied, her voice steady. "And you'll only lose if you think you can." Lucas's grin faltered for just a second. It was a challenge, one he hadn't expected, and one that made his competitive spirit flare to life. He leaned in slightly, his voice lower, more intent. "Is that a challenge, Zyria?" Her eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, Lucas saw something else there. Something more than mere indifference. There was strength, intelligence, and an unwavering sense of conviction. She was unlike anyone he had ever tried to charm. "You can take it however you want," she said, standing up. "But know this, Lucas Mercer, when I accept a challenge, I expect you to meet it on my terms." Lucas watched as she walked away, the quiet intensity of her words hanging in the air. He hadn't expected that, but it only fueled his determination. This would be a game unlike any other, and he always won. Lucas stood alone in the spacious hall, the clinking of glasses and laughter around him fading into a dull hum as his mind raced. Zyria had walked away from him without so much as a backward glance, her words still echoing in his ears. "When I accept a challenge, I expect you to meet it on my terms." A challenge. It was exactly what he wanted, what he needed. The thought of someone so utterly immune to his usual charms both frustrated and intrigued him. Most women would have fallen for the mere suggestion of his interest, yet Zyria had dismissed him as though he were nothing more than a fleeting distraction. That sense of control she held over the situation only fueled the fire inside him. He couldn't let this go. He downed his glass of wine and set it aside, pushing through the crowd to find Zyria. He wasn't used to being dismissed, and that made her all the more intriguing. As he searched the room, his eyes scanned every corner, but there was no sign of her. Just as frustration began to settle in, he spotted her near the far wall, speaking to a group of alien diplomats, her posture as composed as ever. Her focus was entirely on them, not giving Lucas a second thought. The realization hit him hard. If he wanted to win this challenge, he would need to play by her rules. He couldn't rely on his usual tricks or wealth. He would have to prove something more, something genuine. The thought stung him, but beneath the annoyance, he felt something else. A spark of genuine curiosity, a desire to break through her defenses. Without thinking, he made his way across the room. As he approached, Zyria noticed him, her sharp eyes flicking over to him with a glance that was neither welcoming nor hostile, just indifferent. She excused herself from the conversation and turned to face him. "You found me," she said, her voice as calm as ever. "I assume you're ready to take on the challenge?" Lucas hesitated, momentarily caught off guard by her directness. He hadn't expected her to be so forthright about it. He had anticipated more games, more walls to break through. But there was none of that with Zyria. She was like an open field, difficult to read, but never hiding anything. "I'm ready," Lucas said, his voice steady. though a flicker of uncertainty lingered in his chest. He had no idea what the challenge would be, but he couldn't back down now. What's next? Zyria gave him a long, calculating look, then nodded toward the door. Follow me. She led him through the winding corridors of the station, away from the glittering gala and into a quieter, more secluded area. The walls were lined with cool, sleek materials, their surface reflecting the faint light from the overhead fixtures. It was a stark contrast to the extravagance of the party. This was where things were real. Zyria stopped at a large door, pressing her palm to a hidden sensor. The door slid open, revealing a small, dimly lit room filled with what appeared to be various alien relics and artifacts. The walls were lined with old tapestries and intricate sculptures, each piece exuding a sense of history and culture that Lucas knew nothing about. Your first task, Zyria began, her voice low and serious, is to spend the day in this district. You'll leave behind all your wealth, your status, and any form of special treatment. You will live as the people here do. Lucas blinked, momentarily stunned. What do you mean? Work with the locals, she said, eyes meeting his. You'll assist in their daily routines, learn their customs, and see life from their perspective. It's easy to live a life of luxury when you're shielded from the struggles of others. This is your first lesson. A surge of frustration bubbled up inside him, but he quelled it quickly. Zyria's challenge was designed to break him down, to strip away the facade of wealth that had always protected him. It was uncomfortable, to say the least, but there was no turning back now. Fine, Lucas said, his voice tinged with a sharp edge. I'll do it. Zyria gave him a nod of approval, and without another word, she turned and led him out of the room. The district they arrived in was nothing like the opulent corridors of the station or the luxury suites he was accustomed to. The streets were bustling with activity, but the people here didn't walk with the same carefree confidence as the elite. They moved with purpose, their faces set in expressions of quiet determination, and Lucas couldn't help but feel out of place. Zyria introduced him to a small family who lived in a modest dwelling just off the main street. The parents were kind but firm, and their children eyed Lucas warily. They were used to the upper-class visitors who came through, but they didn't seem particularly impressed with his designer suit or his polished shoes. Your job for the day, Zyria said, as though reading his thoughts, is to help them with the daily chores. You'll do everything they do, and you'll do it without complaint. Lucas glanced at her, trying to mask his growing frustration. He had no idea how to do the kind of work she was talking about. Manual labor, assisting in tasks that seemed so beneath him. But this was the challenge. He couldn't back down now. The morning passed in an exhausting blur. Lucas found himself hauling crates, fixing broken plumbing, and washing dishes. Every task felt like a punishment, each one reminding him how far removed he was from this world. He hated every minute of it. The sweat on his brow, the dirt on his hands, the exhaustion that gnawed at him. It all felt foreign, as though he were playing a part in a world he didn't belong to. And yet, as much as he hated it, something shifted inside him. He couldn't hide behind his wealth here. No one cared who he was, what he could offer. He was just another person trying to get by, and he didn't like the feeling. He didn't like how small it made him feel. By midday, he found a moment to breathe and glanced over at Zyria. She stood off to the side, watching him closely, her expression unreadable. It was as though she could see through him, watching for the moment when his pride would crack. But she didn't say a word. She just observed, waiting. You're quiet today, Lucas said, his voice more reflective than he intended. Zyria didn't reply immediately. Instead, she walked over to him, kneeling beside a broken cart that had been left on the side of the road. Her fingers worked with precision as she fixed it, showing him how the simple tasks could be done with focus and care. You're learning, she said at last. This is the first step. If you think this is beneath you, then you've learned nothing. Lucas watched her hands move, the grace in her actions reminding him of just how little he understood about the life she lived. A flicker of respect started to grow in him. He hated admitting it, but there was something about Zyria, something about her resolve, that stirred a part of him he'd long buried. The rest of the day passed in a blur of discomfort, but also strange growth. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Lucas had learned more about himself than he cared to acknowledge. And Zyria? She'd watched him every step of the way, waiting for him to break. But so far he hadn't. And yet, as they walked back to the station, he knew that this was only the beginning. The next morning, Lucas woke up with a heaviness in his chest. His muscles ached, and the dull throb in his hands reminded him of the menial tasks he'd done the day before. His body had never known this kind of strain. This was the kind of physical work that left no room for ego, no space for pretensions. He had spent the last 24 hours buried in a world that wasn't his, and it had rattled him more than he wanted to admit. As he prepared for the second day of the challenge, he couldn't help but replay the events from yesterday. Zyria's calm, unflinching gaze as she watched him struggle with the tasks. The way she never once offered a word of encouragement or sympathy. She didn't pity him, nor did she expect anything less than complete compliance. There was no special treatment for him, no easy way out, and Lucas hated that. He hated how much it was making him question everything he'd taken for granted. By the time he arrived at the district again, he had steeled himself for more. His pride had been chipped away, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat. He couldn't afford to. Zyria was already there, standing by a small crowd of local workers, overseeing the loading of a shipment. Her posture was perfect, the very embodiment of control, and Lucas found himself momentarily caught off guard by her presence. She was a woman who seemed to be in charge of everything around her, yet remained detached, focused only on what was in front of her. He wanted to understand her better, but there was still so much about her that was an enigma. "You're late," she said, her voice sharp but not unkind as he approached. "I'm here now," Lucas replied, his tone more clipped than he intended. He could feel the old arrogance creeping back in, but he forced it down. This wasn't the time for that attitude. Not here. Not with her. Zyria didn't respond. She simply motioned toward the workers and then to the crates that needed unloading. "I expect you to help them," she said. "Work alongside them." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak further. Lucas joined the workers, the same ones from yesterday, and began unloading the crates. The work was harder today, longer hours, heavier loads. As the sun rose higher, the air grew thick with the smell of sweat and dust, and Lucas' exhaustion mounted. His fingers had blisters from the previous day, and by midday, he could feel the tightness in his muscles intensify. Every time he felt like he couldn't go on, he glanced over at Zyria. She was standing off to the side, watching, her arms folded across her chest. She wasn't breaking a sweat. She wasn't doing anything, but her eyes were focused on him, on his every move, and that irritated him more than anything else. She was holding back, observing him as if she were waiting for him to crack. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that the moment came. Lucas was carrying a particularly heavy crate, his arms trembling from the weight, his vision blurred from fatigue, and his frustration boiled over. He set the crate down harder than he should have, swearing under his breath. Zyria's voice cut through the air, calm as ever. "If you keep pushing yourself like this, you'll break. You'll fail." He spun around, anger flaring in his chest. "I'm not going to fail," he spat, his teeth gritted. "I don't fail." Zyria took a few steps toward him, her gaze never wavering. "You can't keep pretending you're above it all. You have limits, Lucas. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." His breath came in sharp gasps, the frustration boiling over. He wanted to snap at her, to tell her she didn't know anything about him, but something stopped him. Something in the quiet certainty in her voice made him pause. "What do you want from me?" Lucas asked, his voice hoarse, vulnerable in a way he didn't like. Zyria's eyes softened, just slightly, and for the first time, Lucas saw a hint of something beneath her hardened exterior. "I want you to see the world for what it really is. You've spent your life sheltered from the struggles of others, Lucas, but you can't win this challenge with arrogance. You have to understand what it means to live like they do." The words hit harder than anything he had expected. He had never considered his life through that lens. He had always been the one on top, always had the means to avoid the discomfort of the world beneath him. But now, with his body aching and the weight of the day's labor bearing down on him, he couldn't deny it. She was right. For the first time in his life, Lucas felt small. He hadn't felt like this since he was a child, struggling to live up to his father's expectations, trying to prove he was worth the inheritance. "I don't know how to do this," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "I don't know how to be what you want me to be." Zyria's expression softened, though her stance remained firm. "No one does at first. But it's not about doing things perfectly. It's about trying and being willing to fail and then trying again." Lucas met her gaze, the frustration giving way to something else. A flicker of understanding, however faint. This challenge wasn't about winning her over with wealth or status. It was about confronting himself, about breaking down the walls he had built around his life. And that terrified him. "I'll try," he said, the words coming out quieter than he intended. Zyria studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. That's all I ask." The day wore on, and Lucas kept his focus, though the weight of the realization didn't leave him. His body was sore, but now, for the first time, his mind was exhausted in a different way. He was thinking, questioning, trying to figure out what all of this meant. Later that evening, as the sky darkened and the workers began to pack up for the day, Zyria approached him once again, this time with a more contemplative expression. "You've made progress today," she said, her tone much softer than before. "But don't think this is over. There's more to come." Lucas nodded, the exhaustion still evident in his eyes. He wanted to protest, wanted to make some excuse, but the truth was, he wasn't sure he wanted it to end. There was something about this challenge, about this journey, that was slowly unraveling him, and for once, he didn't want to stop it. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," he said, the determination back in his voice. But this time, there was something different in it. A humbleness, a willingness to see things through that hadn't been there before. Zyria regarded him for a moment before turning away, leading him back to the station. "I hope you are," she said, her voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. "Because the next step is the hardest." As they walked side by side, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. He still didn't fully understand her, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the path to discovering just how much he didn't know about himself. And Zyria? She was the key to unlocking that truth. The road ahead was uncertain, but Lucas was beginning to realize that he had no choice but to walk it. The next day, Lucas woke up with a feeling that had become increasingly familiar. Uncertainty. He had spent 3 days now working alongside the people in the district, his hands roughened from labor and his muscles sore from the constant strain. His ego had taken a beating, and he was beginning to wonder how much more of himself he could strip away before there was nothing left. The day started like the others. He joined the workers early, his body still aching, the exhaustion of the previous days hanging over him like a heavy weight. Zyria hadn't been as present as before. She was always watching, but today, she seemed more distant, her eyes cold and calculating. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for him to stumble, to break. But this time, Lucas wasn't sure if he could take much more. By noon, the tension in the air was palpable. The district was as busy as ever, the streets crowded with workers and merchants, and the noise of everyday life filled the space around him. But all Lucas could hear was the pounding of his own heart, each beat louder than the last. He was waiting for Zyria to give him a new task, a new challenge to face, but instead, she remained silent, watching from the distance. When she finally approached him, it was with the same calm expression, her face unreadable. "You've been working hard," she said, her voice cool, almost distant. "But you've been holding something back." Lucas looked up at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Zyria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she motioned for him to follow her, and they moved away from the crowd, into a quieter part of the district where the noise faded into the background. She led him to a small courtyard, its walls lined with plants and shaded by tall trees. The stillness of the space was a stark contrast to the bustling streets outside. Look at me, she said, her voice soft but insistent. Lucas met her gaze, feeling the intensity of her focus. There was something different in the way she looked at him now, something less clinical and more personal. He couldn't place it, but it made his heart skip a beat. I've been observing you, she continued, her voice steady but edged with something he couldn't quite decipher. And I think you've been holding back from me, from yourself. Lucas took a step back, frowning. I'm not holding anything back. I'm doing what you asked. I've done everything. Her gaze didn't waver. You've been working. Yes, but I know there's more. There's more to you, Lucas. You've been avoiding it, hiding it. Lucas' chest tightened at her words. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, and it made his skin prickle with discomfort. He wanted to argue, wanted to brush her off, but he couldn't. There was something about her, something about the way she spoke, that made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. Zyria stepped closer, her presence calm but commanding. You've been so focused on proving something, on showing me that you can be strong, that you can endure. But it's not about strength, Lucas. It's about vulnerability. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Vulnerability. It was the one thing he'd never allowed himself to be. He'd always been in control, always been the one with the upper hand. But here, in this place, with her, he felt like he was being stripped down, exposed. I've seen the way you react to things, Zyria continued, her voice gentle but firm. When you think you're losing control, you shut down. You push people away. You don't trust. Lucas swallowed hard, a bitter taste in his mouth. He wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't understand, but he couldn't. She was right. He had spent his entire life building walls around himself, never letting anyone in. Not his family, not his friends, and certainly not her. You're afraid, Zyria said, her voice almost a whisper now. Afraid of losing everything. Afraid of not being enough. The words pierced through him like a dagger. And for the first time since this challenge began, Lucas felt himself unraveling. His pride, his arrogance, they were all crumbling under the weight of her gaze, and it terrified him. He wanted to escape, to run from the vulnerability she was forcing him to confront, but something deeper inside him wanted to stay, to face this head-on. I don't know how to do this, Lucas admitted, his voice low, barely audible. I don't know how to be what you want me to be. Zyria's eyes softened, the hardness in them giving way to something gentler. You don't need to be anything. Just be yourself. Let go of the fear and trust. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Lucas didn't know what to do with them. He had spent his entire life building walls to protect himself from this kind of vulnerability, from this kind of exposure. But here she was, offering him the chance to let them down, to trust, to be something more than the man he had been. He didn't know how to do it, how to open himself up in this way. But he knew one thing he wanted to try. For her. For himself. Zyria took a step closer, her hand reaching out to gently touch his arm. The contact was light, but it sent a jolt of electricity through him. It wasn't the touch he had expected. Not the kind of comfort or sympathy he thought he would get. It was different, and it left him wanting more, though he wasn't sure what more was. Her touch lingered for a moment before she withdrew, her gaze still fixed on him. You're getting closer, Lucas, but you still have more to learn, more to give. Lucas nodded, feeling a strange weight in his chest. The challenge was far from over, and as much as he wanted to push it all away, to retreat into the comfort of his old life, he knew that this journey was changing him, whether he liked it or not. I'll keep trying, he said, his voice steady, though the uncertainty lingered. Zyria smiled, a small but genuine curve of her lips. That's all I ask. As they stood there in the quiet courtyard, the weight of the moment settled over Lucas. He wasn't sure what was next, but he knew one thing. This wasn't just about proving himself to her anymore. It was about proving something to himself. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it. Lucas woke up early, the usual soreness in his body still lingering, but now it felt different. Every bruise, every aching muscle, was a reminder of the work he had been doing, work that, despite his resistance, was slowly changing him. He had always prided himself on his independence, his ability to handle everything on his own. But these last few days, the walls he had carefully constructed around himself had begun to crumble, piece by piece. And Zyria had been the force that had made him confront it all. As the day began, Lucas felt a strange sense of anticipation. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew Zyria wasn't going to make it easy for him. She had been distant, her gaze colder in the last few days, and every time she spoke, there was an edge to her words, a challenge he wasn't sure he was ready to face. When he arrived at the district, the usual buzz of activity filled the streets, but his mind was focused on one thing: Zyria. He didn't see her at first, and a slight pang of disappointment hit him. The thought that she might not show up today, a part of him almost hoped she wouldn't. That way, he could take a break from the relentless tension. But that hope was short-lived. He spotted her in the distance, standing among the workers. Her presence was commanding as always, but today, there was something different in the way she held herself. Something colder, more controlled. She hadn't spoken to him since yesterday's confrontation, and Lucas could feel the weight of her silence between them. He walked toward her, feeling the tension building in his chest with every step. As he drew closer, Zyria turned her gaze to him, and for a moment, their eyes locked. There was no judgment in her expression, just an unreadable calm. But Lucas could feel the question hanging in the air. Had he learned enough to prove himself? "You're late," Zyria said, her voice cool as always. "I'm here," Lucas replied, trying to steady the tightness in his voice. He wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion, the pressure of her unspoken expectations, or something else that made his words come out a little too sharp. Zyria didn't respond to his tone. Instead, she simply gestured toward the pile of crates waiting to be unloaded. "Help them," she instructed, motioning to the group of workers already setting to the task. Lucas nodded, walking over to the group, but the weight of her presence stayed with him. There was no word of encouragement today, no acknowledgement of his progress. The silence between them stretched, and Lucas found himself wondering what it would take for her to finally recognize the effort he was putting in. But she didn't say a word. She only watched from the distance, her gaze never leaving him. The hours dragged on, and Lucas' frustration continued to build. His muscles burned with the exertion, and every movement felt heavier than the last. His hands were calloused, his body aching. But it was the mental exhaustion that was starting to wear on him. He had no idea what Zyria expected, and every time he thought he understood, she seemed to change the rules. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Zyria approached him once again. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held a flicker of something. Something that made Lucas feel exposed, as if she could see straight through him. "You've been avoiding the real challenge," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas blinked in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "You've been focused on the physical tasks," she continued, her voice low but firm. "But that's not the real work. You've been hiding behind your strength, behind your ability to endure pain. But you're not confronting the real issue." He opened his mouth to protest, to tell her he had been working harder than he ever had in his life, but the words caught in his throat. Deep down, he knew she was right. He had been so focused on the surface level of this challenge, the physical tasks, the labor, that he hadn't been willing to confront the deeper questions, the ones that made him uncomfortable. "What is the real issue?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more uncertain than before. Zyria didn't immediately answer. She took a step closer to him, her eyes searching his face, as if weighing the sincerity of his question. "It's about trust," she said finally. "You don't trust anyone, Lucas. Not even yourself." The words landed like a punch, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. His heart hammered in his chest, and the world seemed to close in around him. She was right, of course. He had built his entire life on the idea that he didn't need anyone, that he could rely on no one but himself, and that had worked for him for a time. But here, with Zyria, it wasn't enough anymore. I don't know how to trust," he admitted, his voice raw. The admission felt like it had been buried deep inside him for years. And finally, the words came out, breaking the silence between them. Zyria studied him for a long moment, her gaze softening just a fraction. You have to let go of your control, Lucas. You have to allow yourself to be vulnerable. His chest tightened at her words. He had spent his entire life building walls around himself, keeping everyone at a distance. The thought of tearing those walls down, of exposing himself in such a raw and vulnerable way, terrified him. But in her presence, it didn't seem like a choice anymore. I don't know if I can, he said, the words feeling like a weight on his tongue. Zyria stepped even closer, her presence almost overwhelming. She didn't touch him, but her proximity sent a shiver down his spine. You don't have to do it all at once, she said softly. But you have to start somewhere. Lucas swallowed hard, feeling the pressure of the moment building. The air between them felt charged, and he could sense that something was about to shift. He wasn't sure if he was ready for it, but he knew he couldn't keep pretending that he had everything figured out. I'm not sure I'm ready for this, he confessed, his voice quiet but steady. But I want to try. Zyria's expression softened, and for the first time, Lucas saw something different in her eyes. It was the faintest hint of approval, of recognition. That's all I ask, she said, her voice quieter now, almost gentle. Just try. And for the first time in days, Lucas felt a sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He didn't have to have all the answers. He didn't have to be perfect. But he had to be willing to try. The next step in his journey was uncertain, but for the first time he was willing to take it. He wasn't sure what awaited him, but he knew that whatever came next, he wasn't facing it alone. As they stood there, in the quiet of the district, Lucas couldn't help but feel that something significant had shifted between them. He was no longer just the arrogant, self-absorbed man who had entered this challenge. He was becoming someone different, someone better. And though the road ahead was still unclear, he knew that Zyria would be there, watching, guiding, and challenging him every step of the way. The real test had only just begun. Lucas stood at the edge of the district, watching the hustle of the workers as the sun dipped lower in the sky. His muscles ached from the constant labor, but it wasn't the physical exhaustion that weighed on him now. No, it was something else, something deeper, a feeling that had been gnawing at him since the day he'd started this challenge. Zyria had become a constant presence in his life. Her cold, calculating eyes no longer felt like an accusation, but rather a mirror that reflected back the man he had been and the man he was becoming. Every day, she pushed him harder, forcing him to confront parts of himself he had long buried. But as much as it irritated him, as much as he wanted to walk away from it all, there was something in her, something undeniable, that kept pulling him back. That morning, Zyria had been unusually quiet. Her usual sharp comments were absent, her gaze more distant than it had ever been before. It made Lucas uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bigger than anything they had faced before. He had barely finished his work for the day when Zyria approached him, her usual air of authority apparent in every step. But today, her expression was harder to read than ever before, and it set his nerves on edge. Come with me, she said, her voice crisp and unwavering. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward a quieter part of the district, far from the bustling crowds and the noise of everyday life. Lucas hesitated only for a moment before following her. They moved through the narrow alleyways, the sounds of the district fading as they went deeper into the heart of the area. The air here was thick with the scent of spices and earth, and Lucas couldn't help but feel like he was walking into something far beyond what he had signed up for. The further they walked, the more isolated they became, until they finally stopped in front of a small, dimly lit building. Zyria turned to face him, her eyes studying him with that same calculating gaze. This is where the real work begins, she said, her voice steady but tinged with something darker. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? Zyria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped inside, and Lucas followed her into the dimly lit room. The space was empty, save for a few scattered crates and a single table in the center of the room. There was an air of tension in the space, thick and almost tangible. "You've been working hard," Scifi said, turning to face him once more. "But there's more you need to prove. And it's not just about physical strength anymore." Lucas frowned, his heart beating faster. "What are you talking about?" Scifi's gaze softened, but only slightly. "It's about trust, Lucas. Trust in yourself, trust in others." She paused, her eyes never leaving his. "You've spent your whole life running from it. Now you have to face it." He swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling on him like a physical burden. He had been trying, really trying, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough for her. He had known that for a while now. "Do you trust me?" she asked, her voice low and almost too quiet to hear. Lucas was taken aback by the question. His first instinct was to push it aside, to laugh it off like everything else she had thrown at him. But for some reason, he couldn't. Her words hung in the air between them, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he didn't know. He stopped. The words caught in his throat. He had trusted people before, but they had always let him down. He had always been able to rely on his own strength, his own ability to control every situation. But Scifi was different. She was a challenge. She was breaking down everything he thought he knew about himself. She stepped closer to him, her gaze never faltering. "You've learned to rely on yourself," she said, her voice soft. "But you need to learn to rely on others too. It's the only way you'll move forward." Lucas could feel the heat of her presence, the space between them growing charged, almost too close for comfort. But despite the heat of her proximity, there was no sense of threat, only an unspoken invitation. "Why does this matter so much to you?" Lucas asked, his voice low. He wasn't sure why he asked the question, but it had been on his mind for days. What was it about him that made Scifi push him so hard? What did she see in him that made her want to tear down his walls? Scifi hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "Because I see potential in you. I see a man who could be more than just what he's been. But only if you let go of the fear that's been holding you back." Lucas couldn't deny the truth in her words. He had spent so long hiding behind his pride, behind the walls he had built, that he had never allowed himself to become something more. But Scifi was different. She wasn't asking him to change for her. She was asking him to change for himself. But the fear was still there, lurking in the back of his mind. The fear of losing control, of letting someone else in. And yet, standing in front of her, he couldn't ignore the fact that a part of him wanted to try. She stepped even closer, her eyes searching his face for any sign of hesitation. "Do you trust me enough to let go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lucas stared at her for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. There was a strange stillness in the air, and for the first time in days, he felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't sure what it meant to let go, to trust, but he knew he had to try. "Yes," he finally said, his voice steady, though there was a trace of uncertainty in it. "I'll try." Scifi's expression softened, a hint of approval in her eyes. "That's all I ask." She turned away then, and Lucas followed her, though he wasn't sure where they were going. But the path ahead felt different now. Uncertain, yes, but filled with the possibility of something new. The challenge was no longer just about proving himself to her. It was about proving something to himself, about confronting the fear that had held him back for so long. As they moved through the darkened alleyways, the tension between them remained. But now, it wasn't an obstacle. It was something that bound them together, something that pushed him forward. Lucas didn't know where this journey would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep hiding from the truth. Scifi's challenge had only just begun, and Lucas was finally ready to face it. The days that followed were harder than anything Lucas had experienced so far. He had been working tirelessly, but it wasn't just the labor that weighed him down. There was something else, something deeper, that had begun to gnaw at him ever since Scifi's challenge had shifted. She had seen the cracks in his defenses, and now they were beginning to widen. Zyria continued to push him beyond his limits, but it was no longer just about the physical tasks. Every day, she tested him in ways that made him question everything: his strength, his resolve, and his understanding of what trust really meant. But today, as Lucas worked through the late afternoon, something had shifted again. The weight of the challenge felt different now. It wasn't just about proving himself to Zyria anymore. It had become something more personal. He was breaking down walls he hadn't realized existed, and it terrified him. Every task, every conversation with her, was a reminder of the man he used to be. The man who had spent years building walls around himself, unwilling to let anyone close. But Zyria was relentless. And now, those walls seemed more like a prison than a shield. It had been a long, grueling day. Lucas was exhausted, drenched in sweat and covered in dirt. But his body felt more alive than it had in years. The exhaustion no longer felt like defeat, felt like a release. Zyria approached him just as the sun began to set, her silhouette casting a long shadow across the ground. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way she moved that told Lucas this wasn't just another task or instruction. Something was different. "You've been working hard," she said, her voice steady. "But I've been watching you. I think it's time we had a conversation." Lucas wiped the sweat from his brow and straightened up, brushing dirt from his hands. There was a strange sense of anticipation building in his chest. For the first time in days, he felt like he had no idea what was coming next. "What's this about?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral, though the uncertainty lingered in the back of his mind. Zyria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she motioned for him to follow her, leading him to a quiet corner of the district, far away from the bustling crowds and the noise of work. She moved with purpose, and Lucas had no choice but to follow her, a knot tightening in his stomach. They stopped in a secluded area, a small alcove surrounded by tall, weathered walls. The space was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the distant hum of the city. Zyria turned to face him, her gaze steady and piercing. "You've been holding back," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You've been fighting this, Lucas. I can see it in your eyes. You don't want to let go." His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he felt exposed, like she could see straight through him. He didn't want to admit it, but she was right. He had been fighting this from the very beginning. The challenge, the vulnerability, the trust. It was all too much for him, too unfamiliar. He wasn't sure if he could let go. "I'm not sure I can," he confessed, his voice low and raw. "I've spent my whole life trying to control everything. Letting go, trusting. It's not easy for me." Zyria's expression softened, but her eyes remained intense. "I know it's not easy, but if you keep fighting this, you'll never move forward. You'll always be stuck in the past." Lucas felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't want to face that truth. He didn't want to confront the fact that he had spent so many years running from the very thing that could have freed him. But Zyria was right. He had built his life on control, on self-sufficiency. And now, standing in front of her, he realized that it wasn't enough. He couldn't keep hiding behind his pride, behind his walls. "I've hurt people," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've pushed everyone away because I thought I didn't need anyone. And now, I don't know how to fix it." Zyria took a step closer to him, her presence steady and unwavering. "You can't fix everything at once, Lucas. But you can start by being honest with yourself. By facing the parts of you that you've been hiding." Her words hit him like a wave, and for a moment he felt like he might drown in them. He had never been good at facing his flaws, never been good at admitting his mistakes. But as he stood there, with Zyria's gaze fixed on him, he couldn't deny the truth any longer. He had been running from himself for so long, and now, the only way forward was to face what he had been avoiding. "I don't know where to start," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "But I'm willing to try." Zyria's eyes softened, and for the first time, Lucas saw something more than just challenge in her expression. There was understanding there and something else, something that felt almost like compassion. "You're stronger than you think," she said quietly. "But you won't realize that until you stop pretending to be perfect." Lucas swallowed hard, his chest tight with emotion. It wasn't easy to hear, but it was exactly what he needed to hear. He wasn't perfect. He had never been. And the more he tried to pretend that he was, the more he pushed people away. "I've always wanted to be in control," he admitted. "But I can't do this alone." Zaria's gaze held his for a long moment, and then, without warning, she stepped forward, closing the space between them. Her presence was overwhelming, and Lucas felt his breath catch in his throat. The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment, he wasn't sure what would happen next. Zaria didn't say anything. She simply stood there, close enough for him to feel the heat of her body, her breath just a whisper away from his skin. She didn't touch him, but the weight of her presence felt like it was pressing him to face what he had been avoiding. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The fear was still there, the instinct to retreat, to protect himself. But beneath it, something else stirred. A willingness to take the next step, to finally trust. He had spent so long fighting it, but now, standing there with Zaria, he couldn't deny that he was ready. When he opened his eyes again, Zaria was watching him closely, waiting for him to make a move, to make a choice. And for the first time, he didn't feel like he had to hide. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was still racing. Zaria's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Good. Then let's begin." The words hung in the air between them, charged with the promise of what was to come. There was still so much to be done, so many challenges ahead. But Lucas knew that for the first time, he wasn't facing them alone. The road to redemption wouldn't be easy, but with Zaria's guidance, Lucas felt like he had a chance to finally break free from the chains of his past. The weeks that followed felt like a blur to Lucas. What started as a challenge, a wager to prove his worth, had evolved into something far more complex. Every step he took with Zaria, every task they undertook, seemed to chip away at the walls he had spent years building around himself. But there was still so much left for him to confront, so much more that Zaria was pushing him to face. One evening, after a long day of training, Lucas found himself staring at the skyline of the district. The sun had set, and the lights of the city twinkled like stars in the darkened sky. He had always been focused on the future, on what lay ahead. But now, for the first time, he found himself reflecting on the past. The mistakes, the betrayals, the people he had hurt. It all came rushing back, and the weight of it threatened to crush him. Zaria appeared at his side, her presence as calm and steady as ever. He didn't need to ask. He knew she had been watching him for days now, waiting for him to crack, waiting for him to finally face the truth. "You're quiet tonight," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "What's on your mind?" Lucas didn't answer right away. He didn't want to admit how overwhelmed he felt, how much he had come to depend on her presence in his life, how much he feared that the progress he had made could all slip away if he wasn't careful. But she wasn't asking for an answer right away. She was simply there, offering him the space to think. "It's hard," he said after a long pause, "facing everything I've done, all the people I've hurt. I keep thinking about how I can make things right, but I'm not sure it's possible." Zaria's gaze softened, her eyes studying him in the way she always did. She had a way of making him feel like she could see all the parts of him he kept hidden from the world, the parts he was afraid to confront. "You can't change the past," she said, "but you can choose how you move forward. And right now, you're choosing to face it. That's what matters." Lucas exhaled slowly, the weight of her words settling on his chest. She was right. There was no undoing the damage he had caused, no way to erase the pain he had inflicted. But there was a way to make amends, a way to start fresh. "And what if it's not enough?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if the people I've hurt can't forgive me? What if I'm just too broken?" Zaria stepped closer, her hand resting gently on his arm. "We're all broken in some way, Lucas, but that doesn't mean we can't rebuild. It doesn't mean we can't find redemption." Her words lingered in the air between them, a quiet promise. She wasn't asking him to be perfect. She was asking him to be real. And for the first time in his life, Lucas felt like he could do that. He didn't have to pretend to be someone he wasn't. He didn't have to hide behind his pride or his arrogance. He could just be himself, flawed, vulnerable, and willing to change. "I've spent my whole life pretending," he admitted. "Pretending to be someone I'm not, pretending to have everything under control. But the truth is, I don't have all the answers. And I'm not sure I ever did." Zaria's smile was small but genuine. "It's okay not to have all the answers. What matters is that you're willing to find them." He nodded, feeling a shift within himself. The fear that had once held him back, the fear of being vulnerable, of being judged, was starting to melt away. With Zaria's guidance, he had learned that vulnerability wasn't a weakness. It was strength, and it was the only way forward. Later that evening, they sat together in silence, the city stretching out before them, a sea of lights and shadows. Lucas could feel the weight of everything he had left to do, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something else. Hope. The next day, Zaria took him to a new part of the district, a place he had never visited before. It was a quieter, more intimate area, tucked away from the main streets. The buildings here were older, their walls marked by time and weather, but there was a strange beauty in the decay. It was a place where people seemed to live more simply, where the air felt thicker with history. They walked for a while, and Lucas couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping back. He had grown accustomed to the challenges, to the hard physical labor, to the way Zaria pushed him. But this place, this unfamiliar, silent place, felt different. It wasn't about strength or endurance anymore. It felt personal. Zaria stopped in front of a small, weathered building. Its door was slightly ajar, and from the inside came the soft sounds of conversation and laughter. She turned to Lucas, her expression unreadable. "This is where we begin," she said, her tone quiet but resolute. "Where we begin what?" Lucas asked, confusion creeping into his voice. He had been expecting more training, more tasks to prove himself. But this felt different. Zaria glanced at the door and then back at him. "You've been pushing yourself to your limits, but you haven't been facing the hardest part of this challenge. The hardest part isn't the work or the tasks. It's learning how to connect with others, how to trust and allow yourself to be vulnerable." Lucas took a deep breath, understanding what she was asking of him. He had always prided himself on doing things alone. He had never needed anyone. But now, standing there with Zaria, he realized how much he had been missing. There was strength in connection, in allowing others to help and support him. But it was terrifying to let go of that control, to allow himself to be exposed. Zaria led him into the building, and Lucas found himself in a room filled with people. Strangers, many of them. They were laughing, talking, sharing stories, and for a moment, Lucas felt like an outsider. He didn't belong here, but Zaria was there beside him, her presence a steady anchor. One of the women in the room approached them, her face warm and inviting. "Zaria," she said with a smile. "This is the one you've been working with, right?" Zaria nodded. "Yes, this is Lucas. He's learning the value of trust and connection." Lucas felt a wave of unease wash over him. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," he admitted, his voice tight. Zaria turned to him, her eyes steady. "This is where it all comes together, Lucas. You've been learning how to push yourself, but now it's time to learn how to let others in." And in that moment, Lucas realized something crucial. The true challenge wasn't about how much he could handle alone. It was about how much he could let others help him, how much he could allow himself to be vulnerable. Zaria was right. This was where his journey would truly begin. The weeks after that day in the quiet building felt like a slow, transformative burn. Lucas wasn't sure if he could fully explain the shift within himself, but he felt it. Deep in his chest, a shift that had come not from training or discipline but from something far more difficult. Trust. Zaria had been right. The hardest part wasn't about pushing his body to its limits or completing tasks to prove his worth. It was about letting go, letting others in. As time passed, Lucas found himself returning to that same room, day after day, sitting with strangers who had now become something else to him. They were more than just people he interacted with. They were his support system, a network of connections he had never allowed himself to build. And with each conversation, each shared laugh or silent moment of understanding, the man who had entered this world with arrogance and control began to fade into something gentler, more humble. And then there was Zyria, always by his side, steady and patient. She guided him through the raw, uncomfortable moments. There were times when Lucas felt like the weight of his past would crush him, when the guilt of all his wrongs felt unbearable. But Zyria was always there, offering silent support, her gaze a quiet reminder that he was not alone in this. Through her, he learned what it meant to share a burden, to forgive himself as much as he had asked for forgiveness from others. One evening, after a particularly difficult conversation with someone he had wronged in the past, Lucas found himself sitting on the balcony of his apartment. The city lights shimmered beneath him, distant and cold, but there was a warmth in his chest now that hadn't been there before. He was beginning to feel like he had earned something, not through money or status, but through raw, honest vulnerability. Zyria joined him, the soft hum of the evening city enveloping them both. She said nothing at first, simply stood beside him, her presence a constant that grounded him. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was shared, an acknowledgement of the journey they had both undertaken. "You've come a long way," she said after a long pause, her voice soft but clear. Lucas turned to her, his chest tight with something he couldn't quite name. "I don't know if I've come far enough. There are still people I need to make things right with. Still things I need to do." "You will," Zyria said. "You're doing it now. The hardest part was always going to be letting go of the need to control everything, to be perfect. But you've faced that, and now you're building a new life. Not just for yourself, but for others too." Lucas swallowed hard, her words settling into him in ways he couldn't explain. "I don't know how to thank you for everything." Zyria's gaze softened, her smile barely a curve of her lips. "You don't have to thank me. You're doing this for yourself." He nodded, the weight of her words sinking deeper. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't the same man who had walked into this world months ago. He had learned the value of letting go, of embracing vulnerability, and he had learned, most importantly, the value of connection. But there was still one final thing. Zyria stepped closer, the space between them narrowing until he could feel the warmth of her presence, the quiet understanding she had always offered him. This moment, he knew, was more than just a step in his journey. It was a choice to be open, to face what had always been so difficult for him, real intimacy. Not the kind built on power or control, but the kind that was shared equally, the kind that allowed both people to be fully themselves. Lucas looked at her and something shifted within him, a realization that this wasn't just about redemption or proving anything to himself. It was about building something real, something with her. He reached out, his hand brushing hers. The contact was small but charged, a silent conversation passing between them. Zyria didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in closer, the space between them now reduced to nothing. There was a moment of hesitation, just a fleeting second where they both held their breath, unsure of what came next. And then, without words, their lips met. It wasn't passionate or desperate. It was something quieter, softer, an acknowledgement of everything they had been through, of the trust they had built, of the journey that had brought them to this point. When they pulled away, the silence between them was no longer filled with uncertainty. There was no more pretending, no more hesitation, just a shared understanding that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. "I never thought I'd get here," Lucas whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "I didn't think I could change." "You did," Zyria replied, her voice steady. "And you've come further than you realize." Lucas closed his eyes, letting the weight of her words sink in. He wasn't perfect, and he knew he never would be. But that wasn't the point anymore. He didn't need to be perfect. He only needed to be real, to be willing to grow, to allow himself to feel, and to build something that could last. "I still have a lot of work to do," he said quietly, though the words didn't carry the same weight they once had. "But I'm ready to keep going. With you." Zyria smiled, and for the first time, Lucas saw something new in her expression. Something softer, something more personal. "I'm ready too," she said, her voice gentle. We'll do it together. The journey they had started together was far from over. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But in that moment, under the stars and the city lights, Lucas finally understood what it meant to live with someone else. Not out of obligation, not for some challenge or bet, but out of real, unspoken connection. A bond forged not in perfection, but in shared struggle, growth, and forgiveness. As they stood there, side by side, Lucas knew that whatever the future held, he was ready, because he no longer had to face it alone.